Let's start with what market segmentation means. Simply put, it's the process of dividing your potential customer base into groups with similar characteristics or needs. So why does this matter? Because when you know exactly who you're targeting, your sales and marketing efforts become much more effective. This happens because of two reasons. One, with a narrowed focus, all of your outreach touchpoints, channel choices, and marketing assets will use similar language that speaks to a similar buyer. This means you spend more time on actually selling rather than spending time creating unique messaging and value props for different buyers. And two, if you're focused on one specific subsegment, you'll become more of an expert and build more of a network within that subsegment over time. This has a flywheel effect where you'll become more effective and can more easily become a trusted advisor to new prospects over time. Then, once you gain more customers in that specific subsegment, you can also use these folks as references or specific case studies to help win over other similar customers. This is much harder if you're spreading yourself across multiple subsegments. Most founders I work with typically suffer from two problems when approaching their initial market. One, they're too spread out and trying to push their product into very different types of companies. And two, they aren't specific enough in what type of companies they help. The template associated with this module is the exact template I've used with many of my clients. And my goal here is to help you prioritize where to focus. The way this is structured is each group of columns represents a segment or vertical, and each specific column represents a subsegment within the category above it. Follow a MECE framework, or mutually exclusive and completely exhaustive, so that you map out the entire industry and no company can be categorized into more than one segment. You can do this segmentation many ways, but the idea is that you want the groups to map out the end industry and the columns map out companies within that group that have similar buying processes. So for example, if I was a fintech company and I sold to financial institutions, examples of two different verticals might be banks and private equity firms, and a few different examples of segments within banks might be regional banks, commercial banks, and GSIBs. So the columns represent segments, and the rows represent characteristics of these segments that will be relevant as you're deciding which to prioritize targeting. I'll walk through each one of these rows, which you should fill out for each segment and subsegment. The first row is number of companies. If you think of a TAM, SAM, SOM market sizing analysis, I would consider this your SOM. Find this number through your sourcing databases, such as Apollo, LinkedIn Sales Navigator, or ZoomInfo. Create very specific search criteria for that segment, and look at how many companies come up in the search. The next two rows are only relevant if you're at the stage where you're getting inbound demand from word of mouth or otherwise. I recommend tracking this so you can really break down what types of companies are interested in what you're offering. The next row is relevant only if you have paying customers today. This is where you should list customers you have today to map out what types of companies you already have traction with. In the next row, I'd list a specific recognizable company from that subsegment so your team has an idea of what this segment looks like. The next row is only relevant if you have multiple products or offerings. List which product or products would be relevant to each segment. In the next row, estimate what the ACV or annual contract value would be from this specific segment if they were to become a customer. This will automatically populate the following row, which is multiplying the ACV by the number of total companies by 1%, just to show what your revenue would be with 1% market penetration, which in my experience is a reasonable target to achieve within a year or two if you have true product market fit. The next 5 rows are qualitative, but helpful in informing where you have a right to win. The next row is your thesis on how strong is the potential for you to have product market fit within this segment within the next year, based on where your product is today and what's on your immediate roadmap. Below that is the strength of your network and the connections of other sellers on your team within this subsegment. This is relevant because typically your first sales will come from your immediate network. Though it isn't critical for long-term success, it's helpful for quick wins, which can help accelerate product development if you have more folks using your product sooner. The next qualitative category is ease to start a deal with someone outside of your network. Transactions in some industries and segments are inherently relationship driven. As a disruptor, it can be challenging to enter these markets on your own without a partner. The next two rows are related to revenue velocity. Give a qualitative estimate within each subsegment on time to close a deal. Some segments are inherently more bureaucratic than others. For example, all else being equal, selling a product to the government will probably take longer than selling to a 5-person startup because of the difference in how each org makes decisions. Lastly, don't overlook time to implement if your product has a complex implementation. Some products can be sold and used immediately, but think through it if it will take customers in one of your segments a long time to implement and begin using the product after you've already sold the deal. After you've done this work, you need to use your horse sense on where to prioritize. There isn't a silver bullet answer based on this template, but rather, this exercise is meant to highlight opportunities and risks you should consider before deciding which markets to target. The outcome of this exercise also isn't meant to narrow you down to just one subsegment and tell you to ignore the rest. You might have a hybrid approach. So for example, with the client in this specific example, after this exercise, they decided that they'd focus outbound efforts on the two subsegments here because based on this exercise, they expected it would result in the greatest revenue velocity, but they would still opportunistically work deals that came in from inbound channels in these other segments.